These are the lecture notes for chapter 4, the tissue level of organization. This is the chapter that we also call histology, because histology means the study of tissues. And the definition of tissues would be collections of cells. So cells, groups of cells that work together. And sometimes it'll include cell products, like some kind of a substance that surrounds the cells. But basically, tissues are groups or collections of specialized cells, and then histology is the study of tissues. We will learn 4 basic types of tissues. There are 4 basic types of tissues in the human body. We'll spend a lot more time on the first 2 because we will cover muscle and nervous tissue in those chapters. But we will spend more time with epithelial tissue and connective tissue. So these are the 4 basic types of tissue: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissues. This is a chart that kind of organizes the tissues and gives you a little bit of information. So within the levels of organization, we know that cells are the basic units of living things, and then cells and extracellular fluids and materials combine to form tissues, and then groups of tissues combine to form organs, organs combine to form organ systems. So just focusing on the tissues, we have epithelial tissue, and the function of epithelial tissue, or where we find it in the body, is that it covers exposed surfaces. So, for example, the skin. It lines internal passageways and chambers. So lining the blood vessels, for example, lining the intestines, and produces glandular secretions. So sweat glands, oil glands, or sebaceous glands. And then we have connective tissue, which is very diverse. Connective tissues probably has examples that are not, you don't immediately think that they are related to one another, but what relates connective tissue is that it is composed of cells that are surrounded by a matrix, and we'll talk about what that means. But connective tissue fills internal spaces. It provides structural support, like in the case of bone tissue and cartilage, stores energy in the case of adipose tissue or fat tissue. Muscle tissue is specialized for contraction, and nervous tissue is specialized for conducting electrical impulses. So let's start with epithelial tissue. Here's an overview. Epithelial tissue covers internal and external body surfaces. So if you take an organ like the heart, the outside of the heart is covered in epithelial tissue, and then on the inside of the heart, inside those heart chambers, the atria and the ventricles is going to be covered also with epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue composes most glands, and it serves essential functions. Characteristics are that the cells are bound closely together. They aren't not like connective tissue, which is surrounded by a matrix. The cells are bound very tightly to each other. Epithelial tissue always has a free surface or apical surface, like the surface of our skin would be the apical surface of the epithelial tissue that forms our skin, that epidermis of our skin. But you can also have an apical surface that's inside the body. So if you think about, so like if this is I'll draw this. This is your intestines. And we do a cross section. Let's try that again. Okay, so we do a cross section through the intestines so that we're looking at the inside of the intestine, the space in here, which is called the lumen. So The apical surface is going to be the surface that is exposed to the space inside of that intestine. Inside of an intestine is a tube, so the surface that's exposed to the space inside of that intestinal tube is the apical surface. So the free surface or the apical surface is the one that's exposed and not connected to other cells. The epithelial tissue cells are connected to underlying connective tissue by a basement membrane. And that's important. That's true of all epithelial tissue types. Epithelial tissue is avascular. That means it lacks blood vessels. And so epithelial tissue is continually regenerating. And we know this is true with the skin. Locations of epithelial tissue. So we're going to learn some different examples of like specific types of epithelial tissue. What I want you to do is I want you to know two things. I want you to know some examples of where we could find this type of tissue. And also I would like for you to know whether or not, well, the structure of it. So I want you to know the type of cells and whether or not there's layers of cells or a single layer of cells. So examples where we would find epithelial tissue are the skin, internal passageways such as lining the digestive tracts, the urinary, the reproductive, and the respiratory tracts, and also lining the cavities around the heart and the lungs. So these are just some examples, but we're going to have specific examples in the next little bit here. So 4 essential functions of epithelial tissue. One is that it provides physical protection, and we can definitely see this with our skin. Epithelial tissue controls permeability. It controls what can enter and leave a particular area of the body. The skin is another good example there. Epithelial tissue can provide sensation because it can also be associated with nerve endings, and it can produce specialized secretions such as glands. There's 2 types of glands. There's exocrine glands and there's endocrine glands. If they are exocrine glands, like the ones that produce sweat or the ones that produce sebum or oil, they will discharge their secretions onto a surface. Endocrine glands always produce hormones and release those hormones into the blood. So those are the 2 types of glands. There's also junctions or connections that connect the epithelial cells to each other. There are tight junctions, gap junctions, desmosomes, and hemidesmosomes. And you can see images of each one here. Gap junctions when there's a gap junction that attaches one cell to another cell, it allows for ions and other molecules to move from one cell to another. So gap junctions are really important in making sure that there's communication between the cells in a particular tissue. We also have, let's see here, this one is a desmosome. A desmosome is like a very strong spot weld. And I'm so sorry. Oh my gosh, this is the desmosome. I knew that didn't look strong enough. Okay, so let's come down and look at this one. This is a desmosome. You can tell desmosomes because these protein molecules called CAMs or cell adhesion molecules, they look like oars to me, like you would take in a canoe. But they are very, very strong connections. They allow for very strong connections between cells. So one thing that happens is if you get like a sunburn or if you shed skin cells, such as if you have dandruff, you're going to shed those skin cells. You're going to shed them in flakes, large flakes, or else sheets of skin. And that's because the individual cells are connected with these strong connections called desmosomes. So it's not going to be one cell at a time. You're going to have flakes or sheets that you lose of your skin. And especially in the case of a sunburn, you notice that you can peel your skin off if you get a sunburn. And that is because of the desmosomes that connect the skin cells to each other. What you're seeing down here in picture E is called a hemidesmosome, and that's like half a desmosome. And those are only found connecting the bottom layer of the epithelial cells to the basement membrane. You always find hemidesmosomes connecting epithelial tissue to the basement membrane. And then up here at the top in picture C, we have tight junctions. Here we go. Oh my gosh. Let me get the eraser. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so I'm just going to erase that part too. So tight junctions, and what confused me is because this is a desmosome here, but these are tight junctions up here. Okay, so tight junctions form a tight seal between cells that are packed tightly together. Probably the best answer or the best example I can give you would be there are tight junctions between the cells that form the lining of your urinary bladder, because you don't want urine leaking out of the bladder into the rest of your body. So tight junctions prevent leakage. All right, for epithelial tissue, there's always an apical surface. The apical surface is the exposed surface. It's the surface that's not connected to other cells. Sometimes the apical surface contains folds called microvilli. Microvilli are always, the purpose of microvilli is always to increase the surface area. In the case of the cells that line the inside of your small intestine, the microvilli increase the surface area for the absorption of nutrients. So more nutrients can be absorbed into your blood from your intestines after you digest your the food that you eat. Then we have cilia, which are little hairs, and one place that we have cilia is lining the respiratory tract. So in our airways, and what that does is that cilia sweeps mucus, which has trapped particles like dust and debris, and also maybe pathogens, so that it won't; those things won't go deeper into your lungs. So it sweeps all that stuff up and out of your lungs. So many times the apical surface will be covered with microvilli or cilia. And then we have the basement membrane, which you always find between the epithelial tissue and underlying connective tissue. So between epithelium and connective tissue. You can see here these two cells are epithelial cells, and then the basement membrane is right there. Okay, and the cell on the left that's showing you an example where the apical surface is covered in microvilli, and the one on the right, the apical surface is covered in cilia. Epithelial tissue renewal and repair. Epithelial tissue requires constant renewal and repair. If you think about the skin, that's a good example. So epithelial tissue always has to have stem cells or germinative cells. The stem cells are able to divide and make new cells whenever the old cells are lost. And you always have stem cells near the basement membrane in the deepest layers. All right, checkpoint question 6. What physiological functions are enhanced by the presence of microvilli or cilia? Microvilli is going to enhance absorption. It's going to give you increased surface area for absorption. Cilia is going to enhance movement across the surface of that cell. All right, now for the classification of epithelia, is very organized, very easy to understand once you hear how it works. First thing you do is you decide, is there just one single layer of cells like you see in this table, in this row that says simple. Simple means there's a single layer of epithelial cells, only one single layer. Stratified means there are multiple layers of epithelial cells. So we always start out by naming our epithelial tissue either simple or stratified. Then we add the name that refers to the shape of the cells. So simple squamous would refer to a single layer of flat cells. Simple cuboidal would refer to a single layer of cubic or cuboidal shaped cells. And then simple columnar would be a single layer of very tall tall rectangular shaped cells. So cuboidal is square and columnar is rectangular. And then you have stratified, which is multiple layers of all the different shapes. So we're going to talk about the most common types of epithelial tissue.